speaker is Rachel Fournier. Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay. Rachel is Managing Director of Evolution Health Systems, which is a company that specializes in evidence-based medication and treatment adherence. The title of her presentation this afternoon is Targeting Medication Non-Adherence Behavior in Immunology, a Systematic Approach to Digital Health Program Development.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. So, our presentation today, we're looking at kind of a mix of that we haven't seen a lot of at this conference. We're starting to see more of. It's pharmaceutical companies and patients. The two usually don't go together all that well. I think one of the big elephants in the room too, on top of that, is that a lot of the digital health programs that we see developed, when they're taken out of a lab and put into the real world, they don't work. So we're really interested at my company. I've been doing digital health programs for 15 years. So really taking a patient-centered approach to these types of tools and seeing how can we apply those to real-world program development. So the first thing, just to be completely clear, is this study was funded by Janssen, so a pharmaceutical company. We work with a lot of different pharmaceutical companies. We also work with nonprofit organizations, employers, health systems. And again, it's a shift from a pharmaceutical company perspective. We're seeing a massive shift. There's been a lot of uptake lately, and companies are coming to us because they've never had to deal with patients before. You know, in the past, there were blockbuster drugs. They would take doctors to Hawaii for a week, and away you go. You're making billions of dollars a year. The industry has changed so much that pharmaceutical companies really understand now the importance of the patient and the patient relationship, but they have no idea how to talk to patients. So that's where we've come in, and that's what this project was all about. The end goal is developing a digital health tool. We're just at the early stages, and we really wanted to take a systematic approach to it. So we understand that non-adherence to medication, so patients not taking their medication, is a huge problem for patients. I mean, at the end of the day, patients are going to have much lower quality of life. They're going to be rehospitalized more. They're going to have more complications. And it's motivated by a lot of really complex factors. I think a lot of times we assume that patients aren't taking their medication either because they forgot or because it's too expensive. But that's really oversimplifying the case. And if that were the case, this idea of throwing some coupons out or sending a text message to remind someone to take their medication would actually be effective, which it's not. So we know that there's a major problem from a patient side of things. And from behavioral psychology, there's really complex issues why patients don't take their medication, and it's different from patient to patient and from condition to condition. This is also a massive problem for industry. For our healthcare system. And this is one of the reasons that we have this 10-2 problem where, healthcare costs are going up by 10% every year, but, GDP is really only going by about 2%. So this is a completely unsustainable problem that we're having. About 200 billion of that problem is lost revenue to pharmaceutical companies. And another 123 billion is increased costs to health systems, and that's going up very rapidly. So why haven't we been able to crack this nut? Why are we still sort of in this boat? And again, when we look at a lot of these interventions that seem to be fundamentally sound in a lab, we put them in the real world and they just don't have any legs. Well, a lot of these interventions are built for patients who are already adherent. So we know that one size fits all doesn't work. So a lot of them are focusing on these folks over here who they're the patients who are, sort of dream patients who are signing up for randomized controlled trials or volunteering for them. They're the ones who are going to the pharmacist a week before their medication runs out, making sure they have their refills, following up on their appointments. So we don't really we're not going to affect a huge amount of change by focusing on these patients over here. On the other end of the spectrum, when we look at this purely from a digital health perspective, we have the patients over here, the discordant patients, who are going to require much more intensive interventions than, some web or mobile health tools or some personalized feedback. They're going to require some some really intensive one-on-one feedback in order to become adherent. What we're really interested in is this middle group. There's huge opportunity here for a lot of patients to become much healthier, and they're what we call the coachables. So these are the people who maybe with a little bit of extra support and encouragement can move into the adherent and healthier group. So how do we find out who these people are? Well, I think one of the reasons, again, that there aren't a lot of these really effective interventions out there is because it requires a really interdisciplinary team. So we need involvement from the patients themselves. We need the physicians who are treating them to be involved, the KOLs who are informing the physicians to be involved. And that's just to get the fundamentals right. Then there needs to be good execution, which sometimes is where, I think we've all seen good examples of, things that, again, are fundamentally sound but not executed well, so patients aren't using them. And then on the other side of things, interventions that are very slick and they look really great, or, there's this really neat app, but there's no content behind it. There's no fluff. It's empty when you actually really look at it. So it requires a huge amount of effort from a lot of very different groups to get these types of interventions right. But no matter what we're doing, we always want to start with the evidence. So when we looked specifically at this project with Janssen, we're looking at immunology and people taking their immunology medication. One of the first challenges we ran into is that in reviewing lots of papers, there's no standard definition of adherence. There's massive variation. We're seeing rates reported anywhere from 7 to 84%. So, I guess throw a dart in the middle of that and we can just sort of start there. And I think, again, it just comes down to, is it really as simple as patients are just forgetting or it costs too much money? That seems a little bit oversimplifying things. And so what we want to know are, who are these coachable people? So what we did was we took a deep dive. We said, let's look and see what the data says. So we looked at the immunology literature. We used it's called a grounded theory approach. And we analyzed lots and lots of studies with primary data. This was the process we used, the methods. We started off with over 800 records. That was kind of exciting. And through our different search criteria, we ended up with a much more manageable 27 studies that we included in our analysis. So we were going through these 27 different studies, trying to identify what are the factors of non-adherence specifically in immunology. Because if we can understand the patients, then hopefully we can build something that will actually address those real needs out there. And this is what we found. So this beautiful graph. We'll get into a little bit more detail, but over here on the left, there were 4 non-modifiable risk factors. So these are things we can't change. What was really encouraging was that there were 11 modifiable risk factors. So there's really some room for growth and change, and this is a solvable problem. So the first thing we looked at were the modifiable risk factors. There were 4 of those. And the other thing we did was we broke this into sort of all studies, because these were of the 27 studies, they were from all over the world. And we were kind of interested to see, the health economics group was also really interested to see what would be the difference, because of course, in the United States, we have a very different healthcare system than in the rest of the world. So they were curious if there would be a big difference between what we're finding in the States versus the rest of the world. So you can see over here in the green, what we thought was kind of interesting was that ethnicity was listed as a much stronger factor in the States than it was anywhere else. And I think part of that reflects just the diversity of the United States, whereas other countries tend to be much more homogenous, so it's just a non-issue. What's interesting, though, is that a lot of the authors of the papers will mention this, but not go into any detail or offer any hypotheses or explanations of why that might be. But so these were the non-modifiables, so there's not much we can do about these. Then we get into the modifiable risk factors that we found. And so I think the thing that just knocked people off their chairs, first of all, is if you look way over here at the end, here you see cost. So cost and forgetting. So forgetfulness and cost are probably the 2 least important reasons. Even in the States, so even in the US, where cost is slightly more of a factor, it was still sort of the second least important. So again, this idea of couponing and reminders, that's probably not going to solve this problem. what we thought was really interesting are just right up front, it really has to do with factors around patient education and the therapeutic alliance. So patients not understanding the treatment. As something as simple as that, they're not sure why. For example, my father-in-law has rheumatoid arthritis. You can't walk down the stairs with rheumatoid arthritis, but the medication he has to take, these injections, have such bad side effects that in the early parts of his treatment, he was saying, "Oh, I'm just gonna stop taking it." And so it really took a lot to sort of to work with them about, well, what are your goals, and do you understand what will happen if you actually stop taking it? You'll go back to where it was. So, I mean, again, that's where the side effects come in. So if the doctors, if they had the ability to take a little bit more time with the patients and explain what the treatment is, what some of the side effects are, and then how to manage those, we could have a huge impact on adherence rate. Dose regimen, this was an interesting one, and we're not sure why this came up so much more often in US studies, but this is, I think, kind of common sense. If you're asking a patient to take 4 pills a day, 3 times a day, it's going to be a lot harder to do that than if you just have them come in for an injection every 6 weeks. So that kind of makes sense. So something that came out of there, though, so with the patient education and understanding side effects, we sort of looked at that under this group, looking at the shared decision-making and really a patient-centric approach. So my favorite part of these articles of reading, dozens and dozens of research articles is once you get past the statistics and the chi-squareds and the p-values and you get to the discussion sections, and the authors can't help but editorialize. They love to just sort of throw in something, little tidbits of kind of recommendations or opinion. And what we thought was really interesting is that overwhelmingly these researchers who are so close to this problem identified right off the bat that this is a patient centricity problem, that the doctors aren't taking the time, they don't have the tools, they don't have the time to really work with the patient, to make sure the patient understands what the treatment is, to understand what the side effects are. So what we were seeing was that they were calling for these tools that will facilitate shared decision-making. So something that will make that won't add to the physician burden, but something that's evidence-based and approved that can help educate the patient and facilitate that. And a full 2/3 of studies specifically mention the phrase patient-centric approach. So we were really encouraged to see that. I think most people in the room would sort of agree, as a first step, the literature overwhelmingly calls for patient-centric tools. So the question is, how do we do those? What does that look like? How do we get those out there? Patients really need a fuller understanding of the disease and the treatment. And if we give them some strategies, hopefully they can sort of deal a little bit better with the side effects that they'd be experiencing. I think what we're trying to say here, though, is that, again, it goes back to, I think, Gladys's earlier point about, what tools are people using. One size does not fit all. So, some people may be very motivated by rewards, whereas other patients are going to be motivated by, many different things. So we want to make sure that, once we've sort of identified what the patient needs, we're giving them the tools so that they can pick what they think would be the most useful and engaging tools for them. And that was. So thank you. Okay.
Great. Any questions? Scared to use this now.
Thank you for the great presentation. Could you go back to your slide on the modifiable factors? I was wondering what you found was some of the effective ways of addressing those modifiable factors. What did patients want?
Yeah, so in a lot of cases, you can see these, and some of them are overlapped. So patients not understanding treatment, perceived ineffectiveness. So the patient's just perceiving, a lot of them are around perception and expectations, which again, just to me comes down to really taking time. That's a problem, I think. It takes time to sit down, and I think doctors sort of write a prescription, and we were talking about this a little earlier, write a prescription, and then just assume, first of all, the patient somehow, they've managed to just sort of zap all of this information from the doctor's head into the patient's mind, instantaneously. And by the way, the patient patient's just going to do what they say because that's the doctor. Whereas patients are obviously much more complex, So a lot of it, a lot of it has to do, I think, with just some good quality patient education. And maybe it's as simple as sharing other patient stories. It kind of depends on the condition. Where other patients were able to say, I went through this and I had these side effects and this is how I managed it. Or putting them in touch with, online communities. Or for some people, it's dynamic tools.
Thank you. So just to build on that question, was there some weighting of which factors actually might have the most impact? So whether it's perception, is it about actually more information, or is it actually about other factors in a patient that make it less likely to adhere to a treatment?
That's a great question. So the research methodology that we use when you use grounded theory, you don't actually weight the factors. You're a little more agnostic, and you just sort of indicate how many times they were mentioned and appeared. So it's less, it's just more about sort of just noting and sort of observing in the literature how often this was a factor, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Two quick questions. So is there a tool that derives from this work?
That is the next step. That's where we're leading to.
Always try to look ahead.
Yeah, exactly.
And the next thing is, it seems to me that given the variation and the results of all of the tests, I mean, there's 40,000 peer-reviewed articles in this kind of area. Any model will do an okay job of predicting, but a person has a particular result. If your stratification means that you don't reach out to some set of people, if the intervention is costly, that of course makes lots of sense and is really important. If the intervention is a web-based tool, the incremental cost of serving one more person on the web is zero. Does the importance of the stratification become dependent on the tool that you eventually use to reach these people?
I think that's such an interesting question, because you're right. It doesn't cost more to sort of reach one more person on the web, but to build the algorithms that are going to detect the different factors of where they are, that requires a huge amount of upfront work. So it's always a balance, whenever you're building these types of tools of, who are your target audience, who are you going after first? And so we just sort of look at those coachables as kind of the lowest hanging fruit, and where you have the ability to make the biggest sort of impact up front. But that also leads to something that I think often gets overlooked with a lot of these digital health tools, is that people just sort of think, okay, well, I'll build it and then done, great, let's just sort of walk away and let everyone live these fuller, healthier lives. But they're not, that's not how they work. I mean, one of the beautiful things about this is, like you were saying, is the data. I mean, the data that we can collect. These are living, breathing interventions. So the idea is we look at them as sort of iterative over time, and they're going to grow. And so, we always try to, when we build something after a year, we check in, look at the data, what's working, what's not working, are we reaching the people that we need to be reaching? Are there some other opportunities? And then you kind of make the algorithms more complex. But it is always, I don't want to say it's not arbitrary, but you do have to at some point, sort of say, okay, this is where we're starting, and sort of have it more narrowly defined.
Rachel, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the therapeutic alliance and how you feel that could be advantaged to facilitate better results.
Absolutely, and this is something that we've seen come up a little bit more. In immunology, we didn't see it referenced specifically so much as therapeutic alliance, but we've been doing some other work in mental health, specifically in schizophrenia. And so the therapeutic alliance has really come up, and I see it as kind of this umbrella that encompasses some aspect of shared decision-making. So again, it's this idea that we know that therapeutic alliance has a huge impact on how the doctors and the patients are interacting. I think part of the issue is a lot of doctors, I think they all agree that it's important, but they also think that everybody else has a problem with therapeutic alliance, and they have this wonderful, shared decision-making process. So it can be really a tricky one. But the idea, I think, under this umbrella of therapeutic alliance, just of the doctors even asking simple questions like, okay, did you understand what I just said? Just these very simple check-ins, to hopefully something maybe a little bit more sophisticated, where you're offering, really involving the patients in the treatment.
concept of
I think that's such an interesting. Yeah. So for another project our company is doing. So actually, Trevor, our chief scientific officer, we were doing a project with another indication, so for ulcerative colitis, and I think we all take for granted that, of course, doctors want to have this, concordant. They would like to have this shared decision. But when we were interviewing KOLs, a lot of them were saying, "No, I just want the patients to do what I say." I mean, it's. Yeah, at least they're being honest, but I think what we would sort of hope and expect is different from reality. And I don't know if those are time factors or I'm not totally sure.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. I think Martin actually had his hand up first, but I'm hopeful that all of our speakers will hang around after for 10 minutes for questions. So.
Right, so my question was, you kind of identified the doctor-patient relationship and the patient centricity as a kind of tool to get it right, and having the patients being kind of educated by the doctor. So just kind of relating to your talk, could the pharmaceutical companies provide kind of mini MOOCs that the doctor could point to? Could it be an educational problem that could be solved by kind of joint effort so doctors don't have to be the educator, and pharma could supply the kind of resources?
That's an excellent suggestion, and there's actually some interesting research out of University of Toronto, the Department of Economics. So because pharmaceutical companies as businesses, their business models have changed so dramatically, they really need to redefine how they're running business just fundamentally. And one of the important things is looking at key opinion leaders as sort of essentially marketing agents. So that I think aligns really well with this idea of the MOOCs. And having some experts come in, because I think a lot of course doctors want to do a good job. I think a lot of times maybe they just even lack kind of the words, or and if you can just say, well, when a patient comes in, say this to them, give them just a script and some easy instructions. So yeah, I think there's huge potential for something like that.
Okay, thank everyone thank all the presenters. Let's have another round of applause for the presenters.